The night no one understood. The lights of Las Vegas had always known his name. For decades, they had shimmered in rhythm with his voice, glowed in time with his laughter, and softened themselves whenever he walked onto a stage. Neon signs blinked like old friends. Hotel marquees carried his name the way churches carried prayers. Dean Martin had spent a lifetime becoming part of the city's heartbeat, and the city had spent a lifetime answering him back. But on this particular March evening, the lights felt different, not brighter. Not dimmer, just heavier, as if the desert air itself understood that something irreversible was about to happen. Backstage at the MGM Grand, the corridors buzzed with the familiar energy of a sold-out show. Crew members moved briskly with clipboards and headsets. Musicians tuned instruments. Assistants whispered schedules and cues. Laughter drifted through the halls, the easy, practiced laughter of people who believed they were about to witness another triumphant chapter in a legendary career. To them, this was a comeback, a celebration, a living icon stepping once more into the spotlight. Only one man knew the truth. Dean sat alone in his dressing room, the door closed. The noise of the arena softened into a distant murmur. He wore a black turtleneck, perfectly pressed, a gold chain resting against his chest the way it had for years. The mirror in front of him reflected the same face the world had known for decades. The relaxed eyes, the familiar half-smile, the calm that made generations believe nothing in life could ever truly shake him. But tonight, the mirror showed things no camera ever had. The faint tremor in his hands as he adjusted his cuff, the slightly shallower rise of his chest when he breathed, the exhaustion that lived beneath the charm. He studied himself for a long moment, not with vanity, but with something closer to farewell. Then, very quietly, as if speaking to an old companion, he said, "Well, old friend, here we are." 3 months earlier, he had been sitting in a very different room. The walls at Cedars-Sinai were white in the way only hospital walls are, too white, too clean, too indifferent. Machines hummed softly. The air smelled faintly of antiseptic and something metallic. Dean had walked in that day expecting routine tests, the kind a man his age collected like souvenirs of survival. He had joked with the nurse. He had teased the technician about taking too many pictures of him. He had even practiced a new one-liner in his head, thinking about telling it to Frank later. Then Dr. Goldman had come in, and the room had changed. The doctor did not sit right away. He stood for a moment, holding a thin folder, his expression carefully arranged into professionalism, but not quite able to hide the weight behind it. Dean noticed that first. He had spent his life reading rooms, reading crowds, reading the smallest shifts in mood. This room, he realized instantly, carried news. "Well," Dean said easily, breaking the silence the way he always did, "you look like a man about to tell me my singing career is over." Dr. Goldman forced a faint smile, then gestured for Dean to sit. They spoke for several minutes, technical words at first, images on light boards, measured tones. But eventually, the conversation reached the place it had been moving toward from the moment the door had closed. "Mr. Martin," the doctor said gently, "what we're seeing is advanced, it's aggressive." Dean did not interrupt. He leaned back slightly, folding his hands over his stomach, eyes steady. "With treatment," the doctor continued, choosing each word carefully, "we could attempt to slow it, but I need to be honest about what that would look like." "How long?" Dean asked quietly. The doctor exhaled. "Best case," he said, "perhaps a year, possibly a little more, without treatment, considerably less." The room felt suddenly larger, as if the walls had taken a step back. Dean looked at the ceiling for a moment, then back at the man who had just placed an expiration date on his life. "And the treatment," Dean said. "Tell me straight, not Dr. Straight, human straight." Dr. Goldman hesitated, then nodded. "It would be hard, very hard. It would change how you feel, how you look, how you live." Dean considered this. He imagined hospital rooms replacing stages, needles replacing microphones, weakness replacing rhythm. He imagined his children standing at bedsides instead of front rows. He imagined Frank visiting him not with stories and laughter, but with pity he would never say out loud. After a long moment, Dean stood. "No," he said. The doctor blinked. "Mr. Martin." "No treatments," Dean repeated calmly. "No announcements, no family meetings, no goodbyes whispered in hospital corridors." The doctor looked at him with something close to disbelief. "They deserve to know." Dean stepped closer, his voice low, steady. "They deserve to remember." There was silence between them, thick and unmovable. "I've spent my life," Dean continued, "making people feel lighter than they were when they walked in the room. I'm not going to spend what's left making the people I love heavier. Dr. Goldman studied him, the entertainer, the legend, the man who had made the world believe everything rolled off him. But now he saw something else, an iron decision forged not out of fear but out of devotion. If you choose this, the doctor said carefully, you will decline. There will be days you won't be able to hide it. Dean smiled faintly. I've been hiding things on stage my whole life. That was the moment the plan was born. Not as a spectacle, not as drama, but as control. From that day forward, every morning carried intention. Dean began rising earlier. He wrote letters no one saw him write. He made phone calls that sounded like business and were actually protection. He arranged his affairs with quiet precision, moving through paperwork the way a conductor moves through rehearsal, each detail placed so nothing would fall apart when he was no longer there to steady it. But the second phase of his plan was not about money. It was about memory. In January, when his agent nearly dropped the phone in shock after hearing his voice, Dean delivered the news with characteristic ease. I want to do one more show, he said. One night, MGM Grand. The entertainment world stirred. Articles appeared, rumors bloomed, fans buzzed. A comeback, they said. A celebration. The return of a voice that had been part of American evenings for half a century. Dean watched the headlines with a strange calm. They thought it was nostalgia. He knew it was architecture. Rehearsals began quietly. There were no tour announced, no follow-ups planned, just this one night. Ken Lane, his longtime pianist, was the first to sense something different. Not weakness, Dean would never allow that to show, but gravity. Songs were revisited again and again, tempos adjusted, endings reshaped. Dean lingered over certain lines as if trying to step inside them. You're working like it's opening night, Ken joked once. Dean smiled. It is. At home, his children noticed changes they couldn't name. Not illness, not exactly sadness, something softer. Dean called more often. He invited them over more. Dinners stretched longer. Conversations went deeper. Compliments arrived without pretext. One evening, sitting across from his daughter, he reached across the table and took her hands. I'm proud of you, he said. She laughed gently. You've always been proud of me. Not like this, he replied. She studied him. Dad, are you okay? He smiled, that familiar smile that had reassured millions. I'm better than okay. I'm paying attention. What she didn't understand then was that he was memorizing her. He did this with all of them. A look held a second longer, a laugh listened to instead of joined, a hug that lingered. The most difficult visit came in early March. Frank Sinatra's home had always been a place of noise, pianos, stories, arguments, memories stacked on top of memories. That day it felt unusually still. Frank met him at the door with a grin and an embrace, but something in Dean's eyes slowed him. They sat, they talked, they remembered. Then Dean leaned back, studying his oldest friend. You ever think, he said, about how strange it is that we got to live this life? Frank smiled, every damn day. Dean nodded. If I had to do it all again, I wouldn't change the people. Frank looked at him more closely now. You talking like a man wrapping something up. Dean chuckled softly. I'm talking like a man who knows what mattered. When he left, Frank stood in the doorway long after the car disappeared. He couldn't explain why, but the silence felt louder than anything they had ever shared. And now, on this March night, as the stage manager knocked and said softly, 5 minutes, Mr. Martin, the circle completed itself. Dean rose, he straightened his jacket. He closed his eyes once, not in prayer, but in gratitude. Then he walked. The curtain parted, light poured over him, the audience erupted. And Dean Martin stepped into his final spotlight, carrying a secret no one in that room yet understood. The songs that carried his secrets. When Dean Martin stepped fully into the light, the roar of the MGM Grand did not sound like applause alone. It sounded like history recognizing itself. 2,500 people rose instinctively to their feet, not because anyone had told them to, but because some habits live deeper than instruction. For decades, his voice had drifted through living rooms, nightclubs, war radios, and wedding halls. He had been youth, comfort, mischief, and romance for an entire generation. And now he stood before them again, not younger, not stronger, but somehow more present than he had ever been before. The band waited behind him, perfectly poised, but Dean did not signal them immediately. He took a breath, slow and measured, letting the room settle into him. From the front rows, people would later say they felt something unusual in that pause, something almost sacred, as if the night itself had leaned forward. He opened with "Everybody Loves Somebody," but he did not sing it the way he always had. There was no casual swagger, no effortless cool tossed into the air like smoke. Instead, there was tenderness. He shaped the words as if each one had weight. He lingered where he used to glide. When he sang about finding someone who makes life worth living, his gaze drifted not across the crowd, but downward toward the faces he knew better than any audience. His children, his grandchildren. His blood, his continuation. Dina felt it immediately. She had heard her father sing that song 100 times, maybe more, but never like this. This time, it did not sound like a hit. It sounded like a confession. Each lyric seemed to leave him more slowly, as if he were reluctant to let it go, as if he were counting them. Between songs, Dean spoke more than usual, not jokes, not stories meant to entertain, reflections, gratitudes. He thanked the musicians by name, he thanked the crew, he thanked the audience not for coming, but for staying with him all these years. He spoke about moments instead of milestones, about nights instead of numbers. And every time he finished speaking, he smiled, but there was something new behind it. Not sadness, not fear, something closer to completion. Like a man walking through rooms of a house he had already sold, touching the walls one last time. Backstage, the stage manager whispered to one of the assistants that Dean seemed different tonight. Slower, yes, but also sharper, more exact. He hit cues perfectly. He corrected himself if he missed a word. He adjusted the microphone not for sound, but for comfort, as if even the smallest strain mattered now. Ken Lane noticed that Dean looked at him more often than usual during the numbers, not for guidance, for acknowledgement, for memory, for something unspoken passing between them. Years of music condensed into glances. Then came "Memories Are Made of This." The title alone shifted the air. Dean introduced it quietly, saying only that it had always been one of his favorites. When the opening chords began, the theater softened. People leaned back, some reached for hands, some closed their eyes. Dean's voice entered gently, and for a moment it was the Dean Martin the world knew. Smooth, warm, effortless. But when he reached the word "memories," something caught, not dramatically, not enough to break the performance, just enough to make the moment real. He stopped for a fraction of a second, drew a breath, and continued, but in that pause something rippled outward. A few people in the audience felt it in their chests. Dina felt it like a hand closing around her heart. Dean lowered the microphone slightly when the song ended, looking out over the room instead of into it. "You know," he said, his voice softer now, "I've been lucky. Luckier than any man has a right to be. I've made a lot of memories in my life, and tonight is one of them." The applause was warm but quieter than before, respectful, thoughtful, as if the room was beginning to listen differently. The set continued, but something in Dean had shifted. The performance was no longer just entertainment. It was arrangement. He had built this order himself, shaping emotional rises and falls the way he once shaped shows in his prime. Upbeat numbers were followed by intimate ones. Laughter gave way to silence, then returned, then softened again. He was guiding them somewhere, though no one yet knew where that somewhere was. The band followed flawlessly, but there were moments when Dean would close his eyes between phrases, not resting but collecting, storing. As if he were placing each sound carefully into a place he intended to revisit when he no longer had stages. Halfway through the show, he stepped away from the microphone, lifted a hand slightly to still the band, and did something that none of them had rehearsed. Ken Lane's fingers hovered above the keys, confused. The bassist shifted his stance. The drummer waited. Dean walked closer to the edge of the stage, close enough now to see individual faces, to see moisture on cheeks, to see smiles that did not yet understand themselves. "I want to sing something different," he said. There was a murmur in the audience, not disappointment but curiosity. "This song," Dean continued, "was never meant for a room like this. It was meant for quiet places, for moments when you don't have anything left to impress, only something left to give." He did not name it. He did not need to, he began. "The way you look tonight." No band, no introduction, no arrangement. Just his voice. The first line moved through the theater like breath. Unprotected, unaccompanied. It was not perfect. It was better than perfect. It was human. There were small textures in it the microphones usually hid, slight husks, soft edges, but every word landed unbuffered by instruments. When he sang about wonder, it sounded like gratitude. When he sang about tenderness, it sounded like farewell. The audience did not shift, they did not cough, they did not whisper. People forgot to breathe at the ends of phrases, and then remembered all at once. By the time he finished, the silence afterward was so complete it felt built. Then the applause came, not explosive, not wild. Endless. Dean nodded once, slowly, the way a man acknowledges something that cannot be repeated. He turned back toward the band, and only then did Ken notice something that unsettled him deeply. Dean's hands were trembling, not enough for the audience to see, enough for someone who had known him for decades to understand. As the show moved toward its closing, Dean made one final choice. He announced the last song with a softness that made the words heavier than any declaration could have. "This one," he said, "belongs to an old friend." The band knew immediately, so did most of the audience. "Fly Me to the Moon." The opening notes lifted, and for a moment there was Vegas again. There was the Rat Pack, there was Frank. There were nights no one could recreate even if they wanted to, but Dean did not sing it like nostalgia. He sang it like thanks. Each phrase carried something he could not say. When he reached the line about filling his heart with song, his eyes found a familiar place in the crowd, and Frank Sinatra, watching from home, would later say he felt something tighten in his chest at that exact moment, though he did not yet know why. As the final note faded, Dean did not bow immediately. He stood very still. He looked across the audience, row by row, as if taking attendance not of people, but of years. Then he spoke. "Thank you," he said. "Not thank you for coming. Not thank you, ladies and gentlemen. Just thank you." The standing ovation rose before he moved. He bowed once. Then again. Then he straightened, his eyes shining now in a way stage lights could not explain. Those closest to the stage saw it clearly. These were not the tears of a man overwhelmed by praise. They were the tears of a man closing a door. As he turned to leave, he stopped, just before the curtain, just before the light released him. He looked back over his shoulder one last time at the world that had known him only as Dean Martin. And very softly, too softly for the microphones, he said, "This is it, folks." Then he stepped into the dark. Backstage, the celebration waited for him. Hugs, applause, voices calling his name. His children rushed to him, laughing, crying, telling him he was unbelievable, telling him he still had it, telling him this couldn't be the end. Dean embraced them all, holding each one longer than necessary, pressing his face into familiar hair, breathing in the details he would later need. When his son asked about the next show, Dean smiled, and there was no sadness in it. "There doesn't have to be a next one," he said gently. "Some nights are meant to stand alone." They thought he meant artistry. He meant life. That night, after the room had emptied and the noise had thinned, Dean returned home not as a performer, but as a man who had completed the last visible act of his existence. He sat in his living room in silence. No television, no music, just the ticking of a clock and the faint echo of a theater that still lived somewhere inside his bones. He closed his eyes not to rest, but to replay. The applause, the song without music, the look on Dina's face, the feeling of the spotlight. He stored it all carefully, because now every memory was also a goodbye. And outside, Las Vegas kept shining, unaware that one of its brightest mirrors had just reflected it for the final time. The silent winter. After the lights went dark at the MGM Grand and the city swallowed the last echoes of applause, Dean Martin returned to a world that felt unfamiliar in its quiet. The house in Beverly Hills had always been a place of warmth, laughter, music drifting from somewhere, voices layered over one another in overlapping conversations. Now, though nothing had physically changed, the rooms seemed wider, as if the performance had taken something invisible with it. Dean moved through them slowly, not because his body demanded it yet, but because his mind had shifted into a different rhythm. He found himself pausing in doorways, touching the back of chairs, standing a little longer at windows. The future no longer existed as a place he was going. It existed only as something he was moving away from. At first, he hid his decline with the same effortless charm he had used his whole life. When the fatigue began creeping into his mornings, he joked that age was finally collecting its debt. When the cough returned, harsher now, deeper, he blamed the desert air, the old sinuses, the ghosts of too many cigarettes and late nights. His friends believed him because they wanted to. His family believed him because love always wants to believe. And Dean, master of atmosphere, gave them no reason not to. He laughed at dinners. He sent flowers. He called when he normally would not have. He made his presence lighter even as his body grew heavier. But alone, the truth unfolded differently. There were nights when he sat at the edge of his bed long after the house had gone still, one hand resting on his chest, waiting for his breathing to find its rhythm again. There were mornings when standing felt like asking too much of the floor. He did not speak of these moments. He cataloged them. He learned them. He adjusted around them. He arranged his day like a stage set, removing anything that might reveal what he was becoming. Pain medication stayed hidden. Doctor visits were scheduled early and explained away later. He told the staff not to worry. He told his children not to fuss. He told himself over and over that this was the price of the choice he had made. Dr. Goldman saw him once a month, and each time the room felt smaller than the last. The tests confirmed what Dean already knew. The cancer was moving without haste and without mercy. His lungs were no longer simply failing. They were being replaced. The doctor tried again to persuade him, not toward treatment, but toward truth. "They are going to lose you," he said quietly during one November visit. "You don't have to make them lose you twice." Dean, thinner now, his face more sculpted by time than by age, shook his head. "They're not losing me twice. They're losing me once, cleanly. The rest is for me." "You don't think they would want to walk this road with you?" Dean smiled faintly. "I know they would, that's why I won't let them." There was no bitterness in it, no denial, only resolve. That winter arrived softly, as if unwilling to disturb him. The holidays approached, and with them came gatherings, phone calls, familiar rituals. Dean insisted on hosting Thanksgiving, even though it left him exhausted for days afterward. He sat at the head of the table, watching his family fill the room with movement and noise, and for long stretches he did not speak. He listened. He studied. He memorized the sound of Richie's laugh, the way Dina brushed crumbs from her plate, the way his grandchildren argued over nothing. At one point, his daughter caught him watching her with an intensity that startled her. "Dad," she said gently, "what is it?" Dean smiled, slow and affectionate. "Nothing, just enjoying my view." After dinner, when the dishes were being cleared, he stood alone for a moment in the kitchen and pressed his palm flat against the counter. The room tilted slightly, then settled. He waited until it did. Then he straightened his jacket and returned to the table. In December, he began writing more. The letters had started months earlier, but now they became his daily work. He did not write them all at once. He could not. Each one took something out of him. He wrote to his children separately, choosing words not as statements but as anchors. He wrote about moments only they would understand, about mistakes he had never apologized for properly, about pride he had not always voiced, about gratitude he had assumed was obvious. He wrote as a father, not as a legend. He wrote as a man who knew he would not be able to clarify later. Sometimes he would stop mid-sentence, not because he did not know what to say, but because what he felt could not be carried by ink. On those days, he would close the envelope, leave it unsealed, and walk into another room until the weight inside him settled enough to continue. He labeled each one carefully. He hid them where no one would find them until they needed to. There was one letter he did not know how to begin, the one he intended not for a person, but for the thousands he would never meet again, the audience that had given him a life. He wrote the first line 3 times and tore the pages each time. Only later would the words arrive. Physically, December was unkind. The cough no longer visited. It lived with him. His appetite thinned. His sleep fractured. Some days, standing at the window left him breathless. He learned the locations of every chair in his house the way travelers learn landmarks. He learned to speak through pauses. He learned how to disguise pain as thought. Yet when friends called, they heard the same Dean. When family visited, they saw the same smile. When his grandchildren ran into his arms, he lifted them, though it cost him far more than he let them see. He did not want their last memories of him to include hesitation. One evening late in December, he sat alone in his living room, a single lamp on, the rest of the house dark. He had been trying to write but found himself unable to focus. His breathing was uneven, not panicked, just uncertain. He reached for the remote, then stopped. He did not want noise. He wanted presence. He closed his eyes and let the silence speak. In that silence, memories began to rise uninvited. Not the glamorous ones, not the shows, the late nights, the headlines. Instead, he saw his mother's hands. He heard his children when they were young. He felt the first time he had stood in front of a crowd and realized he could make them feel something. He saw Frank's grin when a joke landed. He heard the way applause sounded different when it came from people who needed what you gave them. For the first time since his diagnosis, he allowed himself to feel something close to fear. Not of dying, of disappearing, of becoming a photograph instead of a voice, of becoming a story instead of a presence. He inhaled slowly, deeply, and reminded himself that he had already chosen how he would leave. And then the fear loosened its hold. Because he remembered the stage. He remembered the way the room had leaned forward, the way the silence after his unplanned song had felt heavier than applause. He remembered Dina's eyes, wet but bright. He remembered the way his hands had trembled and still obeyed him. He remembered the words he had whispered when no one was meant to hear. "This is it, folks." And he understood something that settled him more than any medicine ever could. He had already said goodbye. Everything after that night was not departure, it was echo. Christmas arrived, the house filled again, gifts were opened. Laughter moved through the rooms. Dean sat wrapped in a sweater, a blanket over his knees, smiling, listening, speaking when spoken to. He did not give long speeches. He gave moments. He watched the people he loved experience the holiday without the shadow of what was coming. He allowed them to be careless with the future. That night, after the house had emptied and the lights were dimmed, Dean sat at his desk and sealed the last of the letters. His hands were unsteady, but his writing remained careful. He arranged the envelopes in a drawer, closed it, and rested his palm on the wood for a long time. "You did all right," he said quietly to no one. The winter deepened. His strength waned, but something else grew stronger. His peace. He no longer imagined what he was losing. He focused on what he had completed. A life, a family, a final performance that held everything he could not say, and in that focus the pain became background noise, the fear became distance, the silence became companionable. He had done what he set out to do. He had protected them, and soon he would not need to anymore. The night that never ended. Christmas morning arrived quietly in Beverly Hills. There was no storm, no dramatic sky, just a soft California light filtering through curtains, touching furniture, resting gently on the walls of a house that had held decades of laughter. When the housekeeper arrived to begin preparing breakfast, she moved through the rooms the way she always did, careful not to disturb the stillness too quickly. It was only when she reached Dean's bedroom door and found it unopened long after his usual waking hour that a faint unease took shape. She knocked. There was no answer. She opened the door gently and stepped inside, already calling his name. Dean Martin lay in his bed as if he were sleeping, one hand resting across his chest, his face calm, untroubled, almost younger in stillness than it had been in months. There was no sign of struggle, no disarray, only silence. The kind of silence that does not wait to be broken. She stood frozen for a moment, the realization settling slowly, painfully, and then she reached for the phone with trembling hands. By the time his children arrived, the house no longer belonged to itself. It belonged to grief. The rooms filled not with voices, but with the absence of them. Dina was the first to reach his bedside. She took his hand, still warm enough to feel like life, and spoke his name softly, as if sound alone could repair what had already left. Richie stood behind her, staring at his father's face, searching it for explanation, for warning, for something he had missed. The rest of the family arrived one by one, each crossing the threshold into a reality none of them had prepared for. Dean had been tired, yes, quieter perhaps, but dying? None of them had believed that word belonged anywhere near him. The days that followed moved strangely, as if time itself were uncertain how to behave. Arrangements were made, calls were answered, condolences arrived from around the world, newspapers spoke of a legend lost, networks replayed old performances, radios filled the air with a voice that would never again come from a living throat. But inside the house, the family moved through private spaces that still carried him everywhere. His glasses on the table, his jacket over a chair, a half-finished note on his desk. And in every corner, the same question whispered without sound. How did this happen without us knowing? The answer came quietly. 2 weeks after the funeral, when the crowds had thinned and the world had begun its slow, unfeeling return to normal, Dina went into her father's study to organize his personal belongings. She had avoided the room until then. It felt too much like entering a conversation that had ended without her. She opened drawers, sorting papers, setting aside photographs, touching objects that had once been daily extensions of him. Then she opened the lower desk drawer. Inside were envelopes, neatly arranged, individually labeled, each bearing the name of someone he loved. Her breath caught before she even reached for one. She sat in his chair and picked up the envelope marked Dina. The paper was thick, the handwriting unmistakable. She did not open it immediately. She pressed it lightly between her fingers as if confirming that it was real. Then she broke the seal. As she read, her world shifted. He did not speak of illness at first. He spoke of her childhood, of moments she had forgotten, of pride he had never said enough, of mistakes he wished he had explained better. Then, gently, without drama, he told her the truth. He told her when he had found out. He told her what he had chosen. He told her why. I wanted your last memory of me to be strength, he had written. Not fading, not fear. I wanted you to remember me standing in the light, not lying in a room. I sang that night for you. Every note was goodbye, every smile was thank you. I hope one day you will understand that my silence was not distance, it was love. By the time she reached the end, she was crying in a way she had not yet allowed herself to cry. Not the raw shock of loss, but the deep, shaking grief of recognition, the kind that comes when the truth rearranges the past. She called her brothers and sisters immediately. They gathered again in the same house, this time not as mourners but as readers. One by one they opened the letters addressed to them. And one by one they felt the same mixture of devastation and awe. Each letter was different. Each spoke to a unique bond. Each carried the same quiet revelation. He had known, he had chosen, he had planned. He was dying, Richie said softly, lowering the page in his hands. And he never let us see it. And the show, Dina whispered, the memory crashing back into her with new force. The MGM show, he wasn't coming back, he was leaving. The performance they had celebrated, replayed, praised, was no longer the same performance. It transformed before their eyes, every lingering glance, every softened lyric, every unexpected song, every pause, it was all suddenly illuminated. The night had not been nostalgia, it had been farewell. Later that afternoon, as they continued searching the study, Dina found one more envelope. It was not labeled with a name. It read simply, "To those who listened." Inside was a letter written not as a father, not as a friend, but as a man speaking to the countless unseen faces that had shared his life. He thanked them not for applause, for presence, for allowing him into their evenings, their memories, their homes. He wrote that his final performance had been his way of saying goodbye without burden, that he hoped no one would remember him as someone who faded, but as someone who stood one last time where he had always belonged, in the light, with a song. I didn't leave quietly, he wrote. I left singing, and that is all I ever wanted. When the family finished reading, they sat together in silence. Not empty silence, full silence, the kind that carries voices within it. In the weeks that followed, the story emerged. Dr. Goldman confirmed what the letters revealed. Friends began to reinterpret their last conversations. Frank Sinatra, when told the truth, did not speak for a long time. Then he wept openly, not as a star, not as an icon, but as a man who realized his oldest friend had said goodbye while he had still been laughing. That was Dino, he said finally. Even dying, he was protecting everyone else. Ken Lane, Dean's pianist, visited the MGM Grand alone one evening after the revelation became public. He stood in the empty theater looking at the stage where they had played together for decades, and he could still see Dean there, still hear him, still feel the strange gravity of that night. He later told a reporter that he would never play that exact arrangement again. Those songs, he said, belonged to his goodbye. Fans began leaving flowers at Dean's star. Notes appeared, some from people who had been in the audience that night, some from people who wished they had been. Many wrote the same thing in different words. We felt something. We just didn't know what it was. Years later, people would still speak of that performance as if it existed outside of time, not because it was technically perfect, but because it was true. It was a man standing at the edge of his own ending, choosing not to make it about loss but about gratitude, choosing not to ask for comfort but to give it, choosing not to be remembered in decline but in light. Dean Martin did not simply perform that night. He completed something. He turned his life into a final gift. And in doing so, he left behind not only songs, not only films, not only memories, but a lesson written not in words but in action. That dignity is not silence, it is intention. That love is not always confession, sometimes it is protection. And that the greatest goodbyes are not the ones spoken in hospital rooms, but the ones hidden inside moments so full of life that no one realizes they are watching the end. The lights at the MGM Grand still shine. The stage still holds performers. The city still moves. But somewhere inside that theater, on that particular stretch of floor, something remains. A man in a black turtleneck. A voice carrying more than melody. And a goodbye that never truly ended.